Liberia is a lawless African country. Well, actually, there's just one law that applies here, and that's Murphy's Law. That is, if something can go wrong in Liberia, it's definitely gonna go wrong. Many of you might not have known that Liberia even existed. And if you do, it's maybe because you work in the tax evasion industry. Yes, dear viewers, Liberia is one of the world's biggest fiscal havens, although its citizens don't enjoy a lifestyle as fancy as those living in Monaco. That's it, if you have a company registered in Liberia, but your activity is outside of the country, you pay 0 taxes, just like that. And in the event you don't want to take a flight to a mysterious and remote African country, don't worry, who said you actually had to be in Liberia to register your company? There are several Liberian company registrars in much more convenient locations, Zurich, London, Tokyo. In all of those cities, there are offices where you can register your Liberian company. So what kind of companies are registered in Liberia? Banks? Tech companies? Well, not exactly. The ultimate Liberian speciality is actually ships. This might surprise many of you, except those of you living in a coastal city. I'm sure if you have a port nearby, many of you will have seen lots of ships with this flag or the word Monrovia written on the hull. Believe it or not, Liberia is the world's second largest ship register. Number 1 on their list is Panama for similar reasons, convenient taxation. So I know what you might be thinking right now. If Liberia is so attractive to foreign companies and they have so many ships, well, they must be pretty rich, right? The Singapore of Africa, a wealthy oasis in the middle of a poor continent, right? Well, the opposite is true. Liberia is one of the 5 poorest countries on the planet, and yes, we're not saying underdeveloped or in recession. Liberia's GDP is less than $1,000 a year. This means that Uganda is twice as wealthy as them, or maybe we should just say half as poor. So today's question is, how can a shipping powerhouse and a fiscal haven like Liberia be so poor? Well, today we are going to answer that question, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
The Afro-American nation.
Slavery is the most shameful passage of U.S. history. As you know, up until the American Civil War, slavery was allowed in the southern states. Many landowners had African slaves working in their fields. And I know what you're probably thinking. Well, what does slavery have to do with Liberia? What does this have to do with fiscal havens, ships, and African countries? Well, the truth is that slavery is the reason Liberia is a country. So let's go back to the American South. If you're watching this video from the United States, you already know about the tension in the 1800s between the pro-slavery southern states and the abolitionist northern states. As a result, many slaves from places like Mississippi or Alabama escaped to the northern states like Illinois or New York, where slavery was banned. And this created a huge amount of resentment in the South. Why? Well, because many of those former slaves that found shelter in the North wanted to go back to the southern states and free others. Many southern politicians put pressure on the northern ones to stop hosting African refugees. Of course, the abolitionist politicians were not willing to do this. So, as a compromise, pro-slavery and abolitionist politicians, they agreed on one thing: to send those former slaves to another country. And this is how, in 1822, the American Colonization Society started sending ships to what we know of today as Liberia. They didn't choose this place randomly. America had bought these lands from a local tribesman for $300. And this is why the Liberian capital is called Monrovia, honoring James Monroe, who was the American president back then. Monroe himself was a southern slave owner, so don't even think for a minute that he did all of this to end slavery. And by the way, in order to be fair, we should mention here that the Americans were not alone in this return scheme. Next to Liberia, there is another country called Sierra Leone with a very similar history. In this case, it was the British Empire who sent their former slaves back there. So yes, the sad history of Liberia is that it started as an American colony where they could send people that the South wanted to enslave and the North didn't want to allow to stay. Later on, in 1847, Liberia got its independence and became a sovereign country. But their relations with America, they remained extremely close. And this helps explain everything about the ship registry. So let's take a closer look.
Flag of convenience.
Liberian freemen brought with them the worst American custom: slavery. Yeah, I know it sounds terrible, but it's true. The former American slaves became an elite that enslaved the local tribesmen that were already living in Liberia. This elite is known as the American Liberians, and they ran the country until 1980. That's more than a century. As I mentioned before, this elite maintained really close ties with the United States. This explains what happened after World War II. At that time, the Iron Curtain divided the world into two halves, the communist East and the capitalist West. The Cold War had started, and that meant that many US businessmen could not trade with Soviet allies. The same happens with other Western countries. As you can imagine, this had a huge impact on the international shipping industry. And this is when the US ship owners said to the White House, "No man, are you seriously telling me that I can't dock my ships in a Soviet port? You really want me to stop trading with half the bloody world? Sure, right, that sounds good. I'll do that, because I love politics, and I hate money. Right." This is how the concept of the flag of convenience was born. If US ships could not trade where they wanted to trade, the ships just needed to stop being from the US. So, well, which flag should they bear instead? Which country was willing to take a neutral stance in the middle of the Cold War in exchange for a few bucks? Well, yes, you guessed it, that would be Liberia. For the Liberian government, becoming the go-to place for registering ships was money for nothing. And this is why they rolled out the red carpet for the US ship owners. In fact, they essentially said, "Look guys, if you don't want to build an office in Liberia, you don't have to. Just build it in, like, Virginia or wherever. It's more convenient for you, and we also don't have to do anything." And this is why the headquarters of the Liberian Ship Registry is not in Monrovia, but in Virginia. And this is how, at some point in history, Liberia was the world's biggest ship register on the planet. Bigger than the United States, bigger than the United Kingdom, indeed bigger than any other nation. Even today, Liberia represents 10% of all the ships sailing in international waters, despite having a population of less than 5 million inhabitants. And yes, it really does get crazier by the minute, and perhaps this is a good moment to remind you that we publish brand new stories like this one every week, so subscribe, hit that bell button, you won't miss any of them. But let's get back to the story, because now you might just be wondering, well, what happens after the Cold War ended? Why are there still so many ship owners lining up to register their ships there? First of all, being a good tax haven, Liberia offers discretion over who owns each particular ship. Second, there are many economic advantages. Do you remember that picture we showed you before, the huge container ship with Monrovia on the hull? Just by being registered in Liberia instead of, say, the United States, the owner just saved around $14,000. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. For example, Liberia has a special trade deal with China that can cut lots of money in tariffs and taxes. And what does Liberia get in exchange for all of this? Well, a few bucks a year that they wouldn't otherwise get. Just how many? Well, we're talking about approximately $25 million a year. Now, on a global scale, this isn't actually a lot of money. But being such a small and poor country, this represents 6% of the Liberian government's income. And remember, no matter how big or how small the money is, they get this money in exchange for nothing.
Liberia confirmed a second largest ship registry in the world.
Okay, so I know what you're going to say. I mean, here's VisualPolitik again, standing up for tax havens and supporting reckless businessmen. We've read the comments. And you probably think that this is the point in the video where I'm going to tell you that Liberia is going to become like the African Singapore or something like that, a rich and prosperous country thanks to trade-friendly policies, right? Well, actually, no. In fact, the opposite is true. Let's take a look.
From civil war to golden ball.
As we told you earlier, the American Liberians ruled the country until 1980. They lost power due to a coup d'etat. At long last, Liberia had a native Liberian ruler. This should have been great news for the country, but in fact, this planted the seed for two huge civil wars with warlords fighting it out for control of the nation. And this was the backdrop for some of the darkest and saddest human stories that you can imagine. Children turned into soldiers, illegal arms traffickers, and shocking cases of torture. Have you ever seen the movie Lord of War? It's a great movie starring Nicolas Cage. I know what you're thinking. Nicolas Cage? Really, Simon? Nicolas Cage is legit one of the most underrated actors in Hollywood. It's a fantastic movie. Lord of War proves his chops. That movie is basically about the fall of the USSR when lots of arms dealers bought up old Soviet weaponry at very low prices and sold it to African dictators. Sales like these happened in a lot of countries around the world, and as the movie shows, Liberia were one of them. But again, reality was even worse than what you see in the movies. In the space of 14 years, more than 250,000 Liberians died. This represented 8% of the population. What's more, there were lots of displaced people and widespread economic ruin. However, what happened right after this chaos was nothing short of a miracle. After the Second Civil War, the dictator Charles Taylor went into exile and the country transitioned to a democracy. Since 2005, they've been having regular elections. These are free elections, and the country is slowly improving. In fact, we made a video here on VisualPolitik where we talked about the educational system in Liberia and how they're starting to bet on low-cost private schooling. But still, there's huge room for improvement. In 2006, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became the first woman to rule an African nation. She led Liberia for 12 years. Her administration had some positives, but also many negatives. After so many years of war, she established the stability that the country desperately needed, and with a lot of international help, she was able to start rebuilding the country. Her efforts led her to winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. But there was a dark side too, and this was, as you probably guessed, corruption. Far from cleaning up the country, she was found among the scandals in the Paradise Papers because she had a company in Bermuda. She also gave her sons positions in state-owned companies. And I know what you're going to say now. Well, Simon, didn't you say Liberia was slowly improving? I mean, think about it. The country just went from child soldiers to corrupt politicians. Despite how it appears, this is a giant step. The problem is that when a country depends on international aid, all the money goes into the pockets of a few instead of helping the majority. Because let's be honest here, this is now the main industry of Liberia, bigger than the ships and the tax evasion. You could say that Liberia exports cocoa, rubber, and sadness. Topping the list of all the poverty rankings, international organizations send tons of money here. And once again, this does not help the average Liberian, but rather the Liberian politicians who are all doing rather nicely. But if you thought corruption in Libya had already peaked, think again.
George Weah, from footballer to Liberia's president.
If you're older than 30, you might remember George Weah. He was a soccer forward at Paris Saint-Germain, AC Milan, and Chelsea. He won the Ballon d'Or in 1995 and basically is a huge football legend. So naturally, he wants to continue his career in politics. Well, you might be wondering, well, what's he doing? What are his priorities? As the president of such a poor country, you might think he is focused on attracting capital and industries, trying to develop some local businesses, something along those lines, right? Well, let's take a look at what he's actually doing.
At the age of 51, in a 2-1 friendly defeat by Nigeria, the march in Monrovia was organized to retire the number 14 shirt worn by Weah, who was voted World Footballer of the Year.
There you go. Some men solve their midlife crisis by buying a Harley Davidson, but when you're the Liberian president, you spend a fortune organizing a soccer match with your national team so you can play again and remember your glory days. But you're probably thinking, well, Simon, this is just one day. I'm sure he's done more. Well, you're right. George Weah is betting heavily on infrastructure. Pretty sensible, right? The problem is that most of the infrastructure in question are the roads surrounding his own private residence. In addition, he has prioritized reconstruction in the suburb where he grew up. Yes, he is not only using his political power to solve his midlife crisis, but also to mend his childhood traumas. And of course, even offshore, there is room for even more corruption.
Liberia. Weah's Gibraltar re-roofing project under scrutiny. Approved vouchers show over $1 million US spent.
According to this news story, there are some engineers that estimate the cost for a project at around half of what has been paid. But this is only one scandal among many others. The problem is that all the Weah voters are now outraged. He had been their hero. You have to keep in mind that George Weah was one of the few Liberian success stories, a role model for everybody. And this fall from grace highlights a huge risk for Liberian society. The economy is performing badly, prices are rising, and unemployment is high. More and more protests are organized in Monrovia, and as we've told you, this is the country of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And wrong, in this case, means the chance of another civil war. But now it's your turn to give us your opinion. Do you think Liberia could take advantage of their status as a tax haven to step out of poverty, or maybe they're on the road to another civil war? Please leave your answers in the comments section below. Also, do check out reconsidermedia.com. That's the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, don't forget that we publish brand new videos every week, so subscribe to VisualPolitik and hit that bell button so you won't miss any post. And if you like this video, give us a thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.